This is the Automation World Get Your Questions Answered podcast, where we connect with industry experts to get the answers you need about industrial automation technologies. This podcast series is sponsored by Allied Electronics and Automation, carrying the most automation and control brand names in North America. Now, the questions posed in this podcast series all come from automation technology users like yourself across the process and discrete manufacturing industries. I'm David Greenfield, Director of Content for Automation World, and the question we'll be tackling in this episode is open source software a good choice for small SCADA apps? Now, for years now, a sizable number of end users have been turning to open source software for a variety of reasons: to break out of the confines of proprietary software, to allow for easier customization of their operations, and just to avail themselves to the latest developments from a community of software developers committed to industrial operations software. And there's no shortage of industrial software companies adapting to this open source software trend in response to the continuing upsurge in end user interest. Now, of course, at the same time, there's also a good amount of hesitation around the idea of open source software. For example, users are concerned about how secure is it, how dependable is it, how difficult is it to work with? So joining me for this podcast to discuss these issues are Benson Hougland and Terry Orchard of Opto 22, a supplier of hardware and software for industrial controllers, I/O, and mobile technologies. So let's start by getting an understanding, Benson, of where you're coming from as a representative of Opto 22. And by that, I mean, how does the company view the trend around open source software for industrial applications?
Well, first, thanks for having us, David. We're really excited to be a part of this podcast series and address some of these questions that we're hearing more and more of. I'd like to start off by giving you Opto 22's position on the notion of open source software. And the reality is we're huge proponents of it. We embrace the idea. We think that open source gives us a lot of flexibility in the types of solutions that we can provide our own customers who choose to use Opto 22 products in their industrial applications, whether it's SCADA, whether it's process control, discrete manufacturing, what have you. A little background on our open source involvement. We are a member of the Linux Foundation. We've also been members of various projects under the Linux Foundation umbrella. We're also future members of the Eclipse organization, another open source group that manages open source applications. We make extensive use of open source technologies in our products. One of our most recent product introductions is a product called Groov Epic, or EPIC, which is Edge Programmable Industrial Controller. And on that single device, we employ everything from the open source Linux operating system with real-time extensions, SQLite, which is MySQLite, which is a open source database. Jetty web servers, Node-RED, and probably some of the two technologies that we're getting a lot of interest in, and certainly in our industry and outside the industrial automation industry, are MQTT and a definition, a topic namespace definition protocol called Sparkplug-B, both of which happen to be open source. So all these technologies are built into this Groov Epic industrial controller product for the primary reason of giving our customers and their applications an opportunity to do really some new and exciting applications, whether they're in industrial IoT, whether they're in SCADA, whether, again, they're traditional automation applications. So wrapping that long introduction up is simply saying we're big proponents of open source technologies.
Just as a follow-up question to that, Benson, how would you say, being a developer and a supplier of technologies, how much of your considerable involvement with open source software is based on end user input and expectations, and how much is based on what you just see as a very viable and useful piece of technology that's available in the market?
So it's really a blend of both. You think about software development and software engineering for any company today, and virtually there's really no companies left that build a product from scratch. I mean, that's just not realistic any longer. So, we're not the first to embrace open source technologies. There's many companies out there that, pull in various open source libraries, toolkits, SDKs. I mean, if you think about the communications model for even SCADA, anything that's happening today over TCP/IP, I mean, that's an open source type of technology. You can get a TCP/IP stack from virtually anywhere. So it's driven, yes, a lot by the market, but not because the market is demanding open source so much. They're simply demanding new and exciting technologies that help address a number of given problems that they're faced with in industrial automation applications today, particularly those in SCADA, because the kind of open source technologies that are available to address communications in SCADA are really exciting. And again, getting kind of back to the notion of MQTT. And now from a developer perspective, in other words, what kind of tools we look to build out our own products and provide an end user solution or an integrator solution. There's so many benefits to these open source technologies that people can put to use right away. But the challenge, of course, from a developer like us to do this is to make using these open source technologies as simple and as easy as possible. The big challenge, of course, for anybody who's looking at open source is like, okay, who's going to support it? What, how am I going to secure this? What are some of the gotchas? And so as a vendor and developer of technologies with these open source, we try to mitigate those risks. So you're still getting the benefit of these open source capabilities, but you also have somewhat of a safety net knowing that you have a vendor that will support that effort.
Okay. Thanks, Benson. So considering your extensive background working with open source software, do you have any particular recommendations that end users should look for in regard to open source software for industrial use in terms of being able to assess its general quality?
Yeah, sure. There's really two approaches to adopting this notion of open source in your own applications. The first is, hey, I want to go open source because I want to build this thing from scratch. I don't want to be encumbered by proprietary licenses. I don't want to have to pay somebody a lot of money. So I'm gonna pick and choose the kind of open source technologies I want for my given application. At that point, there's a lot of work to do. I mean, there's you certainly want to look at what's happening in the community. For example, you might go to SourceForge, sourceforge.net, and look at various open source kits and tools and so on. And those might be rated by others that have used those toolkits and, like a 5-star rating system or something. So there's a fair amount of research to make sure that the components you select are going to work together, are going to solve your problem. The second approach, of course, is to go with, with, say, a vendor, and certainly we were one of them, but we're not the only, with a vendor that is adopting and incorporating these open source technologies. Then you can kind of look to the vendor and say, well, what kind of support do they provide? Are they going to stand behind their product? Are they going to, if they're using MQTT or they're using Node-RED or Linux in their product, if I have a problem, can I go to them? And what does the rest of the community say about that? Now that means now we're the developer, and also we have Terry Orchard on the line, who's responsible and runs our developer.opto22.com portal, where we do provide a lot of these tools and libraries for both sides. So if you want to get started on your own and write your own application and address your SCADA issues with completely open source software, but need toolkits and stuff to complete the picture, that's where somebody like Terry will step in. And I believe he has some comments as well about, finding out what recommendations end users should look for.
Yeah, certainly. One of the big things that concerns me that I consider when I'm going to look at some software is, not only what kind of support am I getting from the company, but what kind of problems do people have when they go to use it? Or not just problems, but what kind of success stories are they having with it? What kind of projects have they, found some piece of software to solve the problems that they need, and how did it work out for them? There's all sorts of people that are posting in forums and blogs, personal websites, and all that sort of thing about what they've chosen to do, how they've gone about it. And that can be really eye-opening to the experience that you might have when you go to adopt that technology. And this doesn't just apply to the sort of hobbyist fiddling around. A lot of these technologies, for example, MQTT, can be, really well used in something like a chat room. It's used in Facebook for their chat system, but it can also be used in industrial I/O. And so there's a bit of overlap there where you can, go and really get that deep understanding from the developer that's been playing with it for years and see what kind of struggles and see what kind of successes they've had and use that to drive your own development process. And that can be really eye-opening as well.
So, we've had a big discussion here about open source software for industrial applications in general. So let's get a little more narrowed down into our specific reader's question about open source software for small scale SCADA applications. So what's your take on this, and what do you see as the upsides and potential downsides to this?
So yeah, that's I think the first thing that you need to address when you're considering open source for small scale SCADA is assess your own skills and the skills of those on your team. I mean, let's be clear. If you're going to take a completely open source, download a SCADA software application from PyPy, the place where you can get Python applications or SourceForge or a number of those that are out there, you really need to take an internal look at and assess your skills. Generally speaking, if you're going to be putting these systems together on your own, you better have some domain expertise in the area of networking, certainly in computing, and probably have a pretty deep understanding of operating systems and how that software will interact with that operating system. And then you also have to assess, your own risk assessment in the sense of how much risk am I willing to take on in the event something doesn't work. If I can't get a couple of modules or SDKs to communicate, or if I encounter a security vulnerability, will I have somebody on my staff that has an understanding of these technologies within that domain? And I mean, generally speaking, an IT domain. Can I shoulder that risk? And so, if you can get past all that, then certainly that's a path to take. Now, if you don't have that, and we see this generally speaking in the industrial automation arena, most people are pretty used to packaged systems, and they're going to count on vendor support and so on. And that's where you can get to a place where, hey, I can take advantage of some open source technologies, but I'm not going to necessarily have to worry about staffing up my team with a bunch of IT domain experience, and I don't have to worry as much about risk mitigation.
Okay. And as a follow-up to that, because I know when we first started talking, you talked about how much Opto 22 uses open source software within its products, such as Groov. I'm assuming that with a commercial product such as that you put out, that it doesn't require the level of expertise and resources in a packaged product versus getting a piece of open software, off of SourceForge.net or some of the other sources and implementing it yourself. Is that correct, or is there still certain degrees of expertise required with that, even in a commercial product?
So there is, and it for us in particular. If you're going to use our product, let's go with Groov Epic as a baseline. It comes packaged with a lot of software on it. Some of it's open source, some of it is proprietary, and you pull those pieces together to address your small scale SCADA application. And you've got the Opto 22 backstop, if you will, that if anything doesn't work right, we're going to be there to help you. But maybe you want to also dabble in this notion of open source, and maybe you got some Python scripts that you've developed, or you got a piece of open source software that you found that addresses a particular need in your SCADA application. It could be say a flow algorithm or some sort of maybe a little bit of machine learning code. Well, the beauty of the Groov Epic system is because it's based on Linux and it's based on other open source technologies, we actually offer customers an opportunity to use what's called shell access to gain access to the operating system on the Epic. So you get the benefit of an industrial platform that's again backed by a vendor, but you can also entertain the idea of saying, hey, listen, I've got this really cool piece of open source software that, one, I either don't want to pay for from someone else, or two, I dreamed it up myself, and we'll give you a platform to run it on. So you kind of get the best of both worlds, if you will. It's not quite, you're not having to bring up an industrial PC from the ground up with the operating system and the communication interfaces and so on. That's all done for you. You just focus on the application software that you want to do. And if it's some open source, terrific, let her rip.
Okay, so that's interesting. So like you said, it's the best of both worlds in terms of you can run it out of the box as designed without needing any certain level of expertise, or like I said, you can experiment with it. If you do have those capabilities in-house, you can then go stretch it further from there.
Exactly right, and that gives you a lot of flexibility. And if you feel like you're going down the open source path and it's not really working out for you, it's easy enough to retreat and get back to something that you are comfortable with. And I think that's kind of an important aspect as you move forward. Is unless you're absolutely solid on the path that you want to take, and you're going to go that way no matter what, having those options can be really helpful, and again help mitigate some of the risk with embracing some of these open source technologies.
Okay, so the reader's question was specifically about small scale SCADA apps in particular. But do you see any reasons why open source software couldn't also be used for larger scale, even global SCADA applications? Or is there some sort of a demarcation point where that doesn't make the most sense?
There's nothing inherent in open source technologies, SCADA or otherwise, that would make, I guess, a falling over point, or as you said, a demarcation point to say, okay, at X amount of nodes or X amount of controllers, or say even HMI clients or SCADA clients, where this no longer makes sense. I mean, if you look at some of the applications that you probably use every day, let's say Facebook or Instagram, or a number of different technologies that are hosted on Amazon or Google servers. Those are all built with open source technologies. So relative to scale and capability and robustness, I think you'll find that in many of the applications that are out there and available. It really, again, I'm going to somewhat repeat myself. It comes down to what your own assessment of risk is, and that domain expertise. In other words, who on your staff can help you scale this thing to the degree that you can still handle something if something goes wrong. And that's what it really comes down to: is what is your team capable of, what is your own risk tolerance, and make the decision from there. But to answer the question specifically, there's nothing in open source that says, okay, over an X amount of nodes or whatever, I've got to retreat or go with a proprietary commercial solution.
Okay, well, thanks for clarifying that. So when it comes to using open source software for SCADA applications, regardless of size, small scale, global, whichever, what would be your specific recommendations for users to look for in regards to capabilities and features of the packages that they should look for to make sure that it's viable for industrial SCADA in terms of operability, specific functionalities, and of course, cybersecurity issues as well?
Yeah, that's going to come down to one word: research. There's no question. The same as you might, research various commercial applications for a given SCADA application. You're going to evaluate vendors. You're going to evaluate the functionality. But a lot of that material is produced by those vendors, and kind of gives you an opportunity to develop a matrix to make a decision on what path you want to take forward. The same holds true for open source. However, our origin of that content is going to be in a different place. Obviously, it's not going to come from a vendor, or perhaps maybe even a third party who has assessed a vendor's capabilities. It's going to come from some pretty hard work by yourself. Reaching out on forums and being active in the open source community, and getting a read on what technologies are working or what kits are working. And if there's so many that are out there. I mean, just to name a few, there's Tango and Sardina and Open SCADA, and these are all Rapid SCADA is another. There's so many of these packages out there that are open source and freely available to download. And it's getting on those websites that are typically .org, and getting involved in the community to figure out which ones are being successful, which ones are continually being supported. And that's probably a really key thing. What was the last activity on their forums, or when was the last build made, and so on. So you can get a feeling, a sense of the longevity of this organization to continue to contribute and support a given open source package. So again, it still comes down to research, and whether that's you're doing that with commercial products, or whether you're taking a strictly open source approach. It's getting into digging in, rolling up your sleeves, spending some time on these forums, understanding what's happening in the community, and trying to get a sense of which one you're going to be confident will help you solve your problems.
If I could just chime in there as well, something that I think is really, really important is having this close relationship with IT. You really need to make sure that everyone's on the same page, and that's what's needed at every level is being met. When you go to do this research, you need to know what you're looking for. If certification is something that's really important to your IT team, then that needs to be really important when you're going through and you're doing this research and considering all the different options you have. Because just something as simple as saying, yes, we do need certification. We do need to do things in a secure manner. Knowing that can really drive a lot of decisions. And it's very important to know that before the journey even begins. And I think a lot of that comes from communication that isn't always there. And so that's something definitely worth focusing on.
Terry brings up a great point, and another thing that you can look at when not only embracing, or I should say, engaging your IT team, because you're going to need that domain experience to make this work, but to also look at who else is supporting some of these open source SCADA solutions. And by that I mean, are they involved in the community at a level that, say, members of the Linux Foundation or members of the Eclipse organization? And let me speak to Eclipse for a moment. A lot of people who are in open source use the Eclipse workbench to build their applications, but Eclipse also manages a lot of projects, and they have a specific project area that they focus on for industrial IoT. And a couple of those is Project Paho and also Tahu, and each of these are covering, of course, the MQTT and Sparkplug B specs. So these are open source technologies that you can freely download, build your application out, but they're backed by and managed by an organization like Eclipse or an organization like Linux Foundation. And I think that goes also a long way to giving you some confidence that these particular technologies that are managed by these organizations will have a support mechanism behind them, will have a community behind them. And to Terry's point, many times you're going to have a lot of IT involvement in those types of organizations. So that means there's resources there to help you through the tough spots. So the Eclipse, both of these are .orgs, and they're you can join and learn more about each of these technologies and be involved in the community. And if you're choosing an open source technology, see if they're part of that same ecosystem of like-minded developers, because that's going to go a long way in helping you move forward.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me for this podcast, Benson and Terry. And thanks to all of our listeners for joining us. And please keep watching this space for more installments of Automation World Get Your Questions Answered. And remember to visit our website at www.automationworld.com to stay on top of the latest industrial automation technology insights, trends, and news.